Welcome back. This is the second round of business right here on News Today. Finance Minister Malusi Gigaba is set to meet with business people and investors in New York today. The minister is on a trip to the United States to meet with potential investors. Gigaba attended the IMF World Bank meeting in Washington recently. He said Treasury will continue to engage with credit rating agency Moody's and is optimistic that a third downgrade can be avoided. The other two major credit rating agencies, Fitch and Standard & Poor's, have already downgraded South Africa to junk, but Gigaba is full of hope about Moody's outlook. All right, joining us now is our correspondent, Bryse-Peace, who is in New York. We cross there live to him. Good afternoon to you, Sherwin. Well, how do we know that the minister right now is having meetings, and what is he talking about with the potential investors?
Colin, you're absolutely right. Minister Gigaba is in meetings currently with investors behind closed doors. They will not allow our cameras into that room. Investors apparently, quote, very sensitive about cameras around here. So we are in a holding room just off that plenary where they are meeting now currently. And of course, this is the last leg in Minister Gigaba's visit to the United States, having spent the last 3 days in Washington, as you mentioned, at the IMF World Bank spring meetings. And they're engaging with what is happening around the world and talking to us previously about the fact that South Africa is not the only country facing some political and economic difficulties, whether you're talking about issues of globalization, protectionism. We saw the election in France where the far-right Marine Le Pen was rejected in the polls, the French going more for the centrist candidate in Emmanuel Macron, and then seeing the euro rise up against the dollar, and of course South Africa's rand piggybacking on that euro's strength against the dollar, and reaching levels of around 12.90 today. So clawing back a lot of the losses it experienced after the cabinet reshuffle. So that will be a buoyant mood here, I imagine, some inspiration for the finance minister as he now engages with investors. And of course the question, Colin, as you well know, is around radical economic transformation and whether that is compatible with what investors seek in South Africa. Investors, of course, want stability. They want fiscal discipline, fiscal consolidation. And Minister Gigaba, of course, going to pains to tell investors and international policy stakeholders that South Africa's policy framework will not change. Government policy hasn't changed despite the change in the leadership at the Treasury.
Well, Sharon, one can ask, how is the charm offensive going? I mean, here comes the new minister who comes from a country which has just had a cabinet reshuffle. He's fairly new in the Treasury and Finance Ministry. And then he comes from a country that has been downgraded to junk status. And he's talking about radical economic transformation. And there we hear a little change of a tune to call it inclusive growth. When you're doing such a charm offensive, how are the people responding and reacting to it? I know it's going to be difficult for you to answer me because you're not even able to get there because your cameras are not allowed in there. But looking at the things at face value, how are they appearing?
Well, it's it's a very interesting question, and I can certainly provide some of my personal sort of perspectives, having spent the last couple of days with them and having covered road shows before, led by former Minister Pravin Gordhan to investor meetings such as the one Minister Gigaba is engaged in right now. And on face value, as you ask, Colin, is the fact that the Minister and Treasury are here by themselves. In the past, Pravin Gordhan, Treasury would be accompanied by representations from business, representations from Labour. And on this trip, Minister Gigaba doesn't have that broad South African perspective here to back up what government is saying. And I think that is something that will concern investors. Investors, of course, will also look at some of the news out of South Africa today. FNB, of course, projecting that economic growth will drop to around 0.7% for 2017. Of course, pegging what the IMF said a week ago at around 0.8%. And of course, the Treasury's estimates of economic growth at 1.3% are from before the cabinet reshuffle. So we also want to engage the minister on whether these downgrades are already showing a shrinkage in the South African economy. But that having said, Colin, I think what is good news for South Africa is all these changes, the political uncertainty that South Africa is currently experiencing comes at a time when emerging economies are the order of the day. Investors are certainly looking at emerging economies, developing economies right now. Commodity prices are up. That will be of benefit in the short term to South Africa's economy. But they're looking for structural reforms in the labor sector. They are looking for structural reforms in South Africa's production sector. And so those are some of the discussions that they'll be having. But it was always important for the previous finance minister to be accompanied here by labor and by business to show that they were speaking with one voice. I don't think that is an argument Malusi Gigaba can make at this point.
Yeah, I've just come out of the conference, a preparatory conference of NUMSA this afternoon, where Evan Jim was speaking, saying that, they actually do not agree with the prescripts of the ratings agencies. And the question that one can ask is that if we've had two ratings agencies having downgraded South Africa, then would the other one be singing from a different hymn book if they decide to spare us on a downgrade? Or what is it that Malusi Gigaba has to say to convince them not to downgrade the country, because he has already alluded to the fact that we might be spared this time around?
Well, I'm not sure South Africa will be spared. I think the expectation, although they won't say that on the record, I think the expectation is that Moody's will probably downgrade as well. But it's also important to note, Colin, that Moody's has South Africa currently at 2 pegs above sub-investment grade. S&P and Fitch had South Africa 1 peg above investment grade and then lowered that peg to junk status. South Africa, Moody's still has we're still 2 pegs above sub-investment grade. And I think it's going to be a very difficult sell. I mean, if you speak to IMF economists, if you speak to international stakeholders who are very interested in South Africa, they will tell you that South Africa has been facing a low inclusive growth, low economic growth for a number of years now. The problems in South Africa, things like very high stubborn unemployment that the government has not been able to bring down. These are problems, endemic problems to the South African economy that have been there for a while. What they were looking for was stability. What they were looking for was predictability. And unfortunately, the cabinet reshuffle scared people. It gave them the jitters. And so this is what you're seeing. Moody's will probably downgrade South Africa because the sentiment has been negative for a very long time. Their pegging or their ratings have always had a negative trajectory anyway. So this is just par for the course in terms of not seeing what they want on the political landscape in South Africa and saying, well, this is not what we are seeking from the South African government, despite assurances that the policy framework will not shift. They want to see stability in all the various areas, whether you're talking about the labor market, whether you're talking about a lack of strikes in South Africa, whether you're talking about predictability in the economy. And I think that's the difficult sell that Minister Gigaba has in New York today.
Well, Chairman, I know that you are eyes and ears in New York there, and you'll keep on hanging around so that you can get something out of that meeting as soon as they are done talking. So it's always a pleasure talking to you. We'll hope to talk to you later before the program ends.
Thank you, Colin. Absolutely.